The night the truth came out was one I'll never forget. Madam had planned a small dinner party, a few close friends and family were coming over, so the house was busier than usual. I was helping set the table when I noticed Kemi wasn't around. Normally, she would have been in the kitchen preparing the food with me, but that evening she was nowhere to be found. This was unlike Kemi, so I was a bit worried. You see, Kemi had been with us for 3 years. Arriving as a shy teenager from a poor village, Mr. Tunde had taken a special interest in her education, often spending evenings helping her study. I'd noticed their growing closeness but dismissed my concerns, believing Mr. Tunde's intentions were purely paternal. How wrong I'd been. Kemi was different from the other housemaid who came before her. She was young, maybe 20, and beautiful in a soft, quiet way. Her eyes always seemed to hold a secret, but I never thought much of it. She wasn't the type to cause trouble. At least I didn't think she was. I went to her room and knocked, but there was no answer. When I pushed the door open, I found her curled up on the bed, looking nervous. She looked at me with hollow eyes and whispered, "I can't hide it anymore." Before I could ask her what she meant, Madam's voice echoed from the hallway, calling us to help serve the guests. I hurried back, trying to push the thought of Kemi's words from my mind, but it clung to me like a shadow. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off between Kemi and Mr. Tunde lately. There was an odd tension, too subtle for anyone else to notice, but just enough to make me suspicious. Sometimes I'd catch a glance exchanged between them that was far too quick to mean anything, or maybe it was the way Mr. Tunde's hand would twitch every time she walked into the room. I felt sick to my stomach, but I pushed it aside, hoping I was imagining things. While Madam was charming the guests, Mr. Tunde sat sadly on the sofa, looking lost in thought. It wasn't always like this. There was a time when Madam and Mr. Tunde seemed like the perfect couple, his deep laugh filling the house and her gentle touch always smoothing over any rough edges. But recently, there was a distance between them, like a shadow creeping in, one that I couldn't quite place. Mr. Tunde spent more time away, always working late, and Madam, while still warm to her guests, was colder when it came to her husband. As the night went on, I could feel the tension growing. Mr. Tunde was unusually quiet, barely speaking to anyone. His eyes darted nervously around the room, and every time Kemi entered, he stiffened. Madam, of course, didn't notice. She was too busy entertaining her guests, laughing and joking like nothing was wrong. But I knew something was about to happen. The air in the room felt thick, charged with an electricity I couldn't explain. Then, in the middle of dinner, Kemi walked into the dining room, her hands shaking as she placed a tray of food on the table. She paused, her eyes glancing between Madam and Mr. Tunde. I could see the fear in her face, and before anyone could say anything, she spoke. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry." The room fell silent. Everyone stopped eating, forks and spoons frozen in midair. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. Madam turned to her with a puzzled look. "What are you talking about, Kemi?" she asked, her tone gentle but confused. The room was filled with the scent of roasted chicken and spices, but it all felt wrong, like a mask covering something rotten underneath. I could hear the clock ticking in the corner, each second stretching into eternity. Kemi stood there, her hands trembling, a bead of sweat rolling down her temple. Her breath fastened as she finally looked at Madam, her face pale, and I knew what was coming. I felt it like a punch in my belly before the words even left her lips. Kemi's eyes filled with tears, and she took a deep breath, her whole body trembling. "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air like a bomb about to explode. Madam stared at her, unblinking, trying to process what she had just heard. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispering among themselves. But I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Madam slowly rose from her chair, her face pale, her lips trembling. Who's... Her voice cracked, but she didn't need to finish the question. Kemi didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Her eyes flicked toward Mr. Tunda, and at that moment, everything shattered. Madam followed her gaze, and when she realized what Kemi was implying, she let out a sound I'll never forget. It was somewhere between a scream and a sob, a sound of pure heartbreak and rage. "Tunda?" Madam whispered, her voice breaking. "Tell me this isn't true." Mr. Tunde stood pale and trembling. "Ayo, listen," he pleaded, his eyes darting to Kemi. She's just a child. It's not what you think." It was a mistake. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The room was so silent you could hear a pin drop. And then Madam pounced. She grabbed Kemi by the arm, yanking her forward with a force I didn't know she had. "You little slut!" she screamed, shaking her so hard I thought her arm might break. "How dare you! How could you do this to me?" Kemi was crying now, sobbing uncontrollably as Madam's nails dug into her skin. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," she kept repeating, but it was too late. The damage was done. "Tunde, say something," Madam screamed, turning on her husband, who was still sitting frozen in his chair. "How could you do this to me? To our family? To her?" Mr. Tunde finally stood, his face filled with guilt and shame. "Ayo, please," he started, but Madam wasn't listening. She was beyond reasoning, consumed by the betrayal. I wanted to run, to hide, but I couldn't leave Kemi like that. My heart raced as I stood there, torn between loyalty to Madam and the urge to protect Kemi. I had suspected something was wrong for months, catching glimpses of secret touches and whispered conversations that stopped when I entered a room, but I had chosen to stay silent, convincing myself it wasn't my place to speak. Now, faced with the consequences of my silence, guilt gripped me. Could I have prevented this if I'd spoken up sooner? Or would I have just been another casualty in this web of secrets and lies? At that moment, I realized that in trying to protect everyone, I had failed them all. The weight of my inaction crushed me. I stepped forward, trying to calm Madam down, but she was too far gone. "She's just a girl," I said softly, but Madam turned on me, her eyes wild with fury. "She's a homewrecker!" Madam spat, pushing Kemi away so hard she fell to the floor. "She ruined everything! She ruined my life!" Kemi lay on the ground, curled into a ball, crying uncontrollably. I wanted to comfort her, but I didn't know how. Madam stood over her, shaking with rage, and for a moment, I thought she might actually hurt her. But then, as if something inside her snapped, Madam's shoulders slumped. She looked at Kemi with disgust and then at her husband, who couldn't even meet her gaze. "I want both of you out of my house," she said, her voice cold and flat. "Now." No one moved. The guests sat in shocked silence, too afraid to speak. I looked at Kemi, who was still on the floor, shaking her head in disbelief. I wanted to help her up, but it was as if I was bolted to the ground. Madam didn't wait for a response. She turned and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The sound echoed through the house, and for a moment, everything was still. As the chaos of that night finally subsided, a weird quiet settled over the house. The guests had long since fled, leaving behind half-eaten meals and overturned chairs. I spent the night listening to Madam's muffled cries through the walls, feeling helpless and lost. After that night, nothing was ever the same. Kemi was gone by morning, her belongings packed into a small bag. I didn't see her leave, but I heard whispers from the neighbors. They said she went back to her village, but no one really knew for sure. She had no one to say goodbye to, no one who would miss her. Mr. Tunda, well, he left soon after. Madam couldn't bear to look at him. She filed for divorce, and within a few months he was gone too. I heard he had moved to another city, starting a new life, but forever marked by his mistakes. In the months that followed, I caught glimpses of a side of Madam I'd never seen before. One evening, I found her in Kemi's old room, clutching a photo of happier times. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but there was something else there too. A flicker of... was it longing? Regret? She noticed me and quickly composed herself. "Life is never simple, is it?" she mused, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes I wonder if..." She trailed off, shaking her head. I wanted to ask what she meant, but she brushed past me. The house, once full of laughter and life, became a shell of its former self. Madam stopped going to her shop and stopped seeing friends. She spent most of her days locked in her room, staring at old photographs and wondering where everything went wrong. And me? I stayed. I stayed because I had no choice. Whenever I walked past Kemi's old room, a hollow ache would always fill my chest. I wondered if things could have been different if I had spoken up sooner or if I had warned Madam before it was too late. But the truth is, secrets have a way of coming out, no matter how hard you try to bury them. Months turned into years, and rumors reached us that Kemi had given birth to a baby girl, a child who would grow up never knowing her father. Years passed, each one a little less painful than the last. The house settled into a new rhythm, quieter and more sober than before. Madam and I rarely spoke of that night, but I often wondered about Kemi and the child she carried, imagining the life they might be living. Then, one ordinary afternoon, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Kemi standing there, a young girl clutching her hand. Behind them stood Mr. Tunda, his face looking very much older now. Before I could speak, Madam appeared. As she looked at Kemi and the girl, this child who was as much her husband's as her enemy's, something inside her broke. Madam had spent years resenting what had happened, but standing there now, all she felt was exhaustion. For a moment, I thought she would attack them. But to my astonishment, Madam's face softened. "Come in," she said, her voice trembling. "It's time we talked. Please like and subscribe.